We come now to the adjournment. The whip to move.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
Thank you. The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mr. David Amess.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I have agreed with the Minister to take a number of interventions on the basis that all of those interventions are of a pleasant nature. Margaret Hilda Thatcher, born on the 13th of October 1925, died Baroness Thatcher of Kesteven on the 8th of April 2013. Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1979 until 1990. Member of Parliament of Finchley from 1959 until 1992. Mr. Speaker, I was in America visiting my oldest daughter who lives in Hollywood, an aspiring actress, when she knocked on my door of my bedroom and broke the news that Margaret Thatcher died. Being an actress, I didn't initially believe what she had to say. So tonight, Mr. Speaker, because I couldn't get back in time for what was a very moving occasion when the House made their own tributes, I am unashamedly using this occasion to make my own tribute to Margaret Thatcher. And that being said, Mr. Speaker, I would like to refer members to a speech which I gave in this very place where I made my maiden speech on the 7th of December 1990. And as my good friend the Whip says from a sedentary place, he was there when I made it. It was on a Friday, and I can do no better than quote the terms of the motion that I initiated. This House notes the political developments in the United Kingdom since 1979, salutes the Right Honourable Member for Finchley for the part she has played in these developments, congratulates her upon her leadership of the country as Prime Minister for 11 and a half years, and pays tribute to the many fine personal qualities that she brought to the performance of her duties, including in particular her integrity, steadfastness and courage, and looks forward to her continued contribution to the political life of this country. Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, 20 years ago I was a little upset about the way Margaret, as I put it, was removed from office. Well, I've calmed down now and am in a position to reflect on her life and the service she gave to her country. Only today, Mr. Speaker, I have been contacted by a local councillor in Grantham, Councillor Davies. Apparently independent of the council, they are definitely going to erect a statue to Margaret. I support their campaign, and I hope other members will do likewise in Grantham. I visited Grantham earlier this year, never been there before, and I visited her birthplace, which is now a health spa. Very humble, I should say. It certainly was a humble little shop that she used to run, but obviously Grantham has changed. It's right opposite Asda. But certainly, if Margaret had been born in Southend West, we would be celebrating the fact that we had that very great citizen as one of our local residents. Mr. Speaker, I can think of no other British politicians whose legacy are as lasting or far-reaching as Margaret's. There can be no doubt that her philosophy has influenced every aspect of our lives today. I myself have been a member of the Conservative Party for 45 years, and I would never have joined the party all those years ago if it wasn't for Margaret. And I was a resident in the London Borough of Newham, the constituency that produced the first ever Labour Member of Parliament for Keir Hardie. But I was sick to death of people reminiscing about how the good old days were and how to get out of poverty. I wanted someone to inspire me with a philosophy that, if I followed, would get me out of poverty. And as far as I was concerned, that was Margaret Thatcher. I missed the debate here but I did attend the ceremonial funeral, and I thought that Margaret's funeral was an absolute tribute to those who organised it and to this country. And it was a privilege for I and so many of our colleagues who didn't really know Margaret, they weren't in the House when she was an MP, but were inspired in every way by the sort of person she was. So when she became the leader in 1979, Britain was, as we all know, the sick man of Europe. We were the Greece of our times, seeking aid from the IMF. The rot was really setting in. Interest rates were staggeringly high at nearly 14%, and if you think what they are today. And inflation was in double digits. The top rate of tax was 83%. The power was in the hands of the unions, which gave us the winter of discontent. The 3-day week was fresh in the memory of many. The dead could not be buried, and rubbish was not being collected. And I was there. I was living during those times. I haven't read it in a book. I experienced it. Evidently, all was not well, and something had to change. But, Mr. Speaker, Baroness Thatcher did not, as many have claimed, break the post-war consensus. The post-war consensus had actually destroyed itself. And it was the job of the then Mrs. Thatcher to build a new Britain from the ashes. In the words of Lord Healey, of all people, the time had come for a shift from government to the market, as far as economic policy was concerned, and ending the rule of the trade unions in deciding policy. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I've already said, I myself was privileged enough to have been elected together with my honourable friend for Aldershot in 1983 and my honourable friend for Bexley Heath. Indeed, it was from this very spot that I made my maiden speech on the community community charge. I think they called it the poll tax then, but I never referred to it as the poll tax. And the House was absolutely packed, and I followed the speech of Sir Ted Heath, and Matthew Parris was there, and in your place was the late Jack Weatherall. It was a fantastic occasion, and I flatter myself Margaret was sitting there where my honourable friend, right honourable friend, the member for Rayleigh is, listening to my support for the then policy. She was absolutely inspirational. And this isn't a criticism, Mr. Speaker, so please don't take offence at it, thinking about the debate last week. In those days, the chamber was full of giants. There were many experts. I was in awe of everyone. Well, 30 years on, I'm not in awe of anyone. I feel that this is now a chamber of amateurs. I don't mean that in a nasty sense. I mean it in the sense of the way we are now. You have to look to the other place for the real experts. Mr. Speaker, we are all sent here, however articulate we are or not, as equals. So, as my voice wasn't heard last Thursday, I'm very glad that my voice is heard this evening in praising Margaret Thatcher and her great legacy. She understood that people had the opportunity to be upwardly mobile. The right to buy, in my then constituency of Basildon, gave millions. We had 30,000 houses in public ownership. It gave the chance for many people to own their property for the first time, and share ownership trebled during Margaret's decade. Historically, long-term gains financially are made in housing and equity investments, unlike which are cash savings often gobbled up by inflation. Naturally, therefore, I feel that with people interested in business and the economy as newly empowered share owners and mortgage bearers, strikes were much less appealing and the power of the unions was broken. Britain became a place to aspire to, and we were really back in business. And I remember my right honourable friend, the member for Rayleigh, who was a local councillor in my then constituency of Basildon. People began to work together to build growth. And it is no coincidence that in the 80s many successful start-ups were born, including Waterstones, Dairycrest, Bloomsbury, Sky and Virgin Atlantic. And I certainly recall with my two honourable friends when we were invited by the chairman of British Airways, and that was one great opportunity that he grasped, and he was certainly, Lord King, another inspirational leader. And then, of course, Mr. Speaker, there is a fundamental legacy of privatisation and economic policy. This is a policy that was never reversed by successive governments and has been copied all over the world. So as late as 1977, the United Kingdom government was still nationalising industry, aerospace and shipbuilding, and Baroness Thatcher had to reverse this trend in order to resuscitate what was then our country known as the sick man of Europe. More than 50 companies were put back into the hands of the people, including huge companies like British Gas, British Telecoms and British Airways. Not only was £50 billion raised for the Treasury, but competition was birthed and private shareholding grew. The consumer benefit of gas prices falling by 25% in 1995 and telecom charges fell by 40%. The basic rate of tax fell from 33% in 1979 to 23% by the time Margaret left office. A strong pro-aspiration message was heard. Incredibly, 2 million working days were lost to strikes in 1979, whereas it was down to 2 million in 1990. An absolutely staggering decline. Certainly.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend, and he's making a wonderful tribute to the salvation of the nation. I wonder if you would agree with me that the figures that he's just given about the reduction in the number of strikes from 29 million days lost to 2 million days is evidence that, far from being divisive, this magnificent woman was responsible for restoring to the members of trade unions power which had been seized by their leaders to use for political purposes.
I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend. I paid tribute to him when he was appointed as Margaret's parliamentary private secretary. If only perhaps he had been her private parliamentary secretary a little earlier, she would never have lost by the 4 votes, but that's probably rewriting history. I absolutely agree the way Margaret's legacy has been completely misrepresented. So contrary to, I feel I can say this now, Mr. Speaker, contrary to left-wing opinion, Britain's manufacturing production rose by 7.5% during Baroness Thatcher's time as Prime Minister. In short, it is because of these policies, right to buy, share ownership, privatisation, tax cuts, fewer days lost to strikes and other such policies, that Baroness Thatcher was able to bring Britain back from the brink and build a stronger economy. Now, in education, certainly.
Gentleman, forgive me, I've spoken to him beforehand and he knows what I'm going to say. And I just want to say that Baroness Thatcher's legacy is threefold for us in Northern Ireland. First of all, the Belfast Agreement, where you know that we as unions were not happy with that, but Baroness Thatcher recognised that in her memoirs and said so accordingly, and we appreciate that and understand that. The second thing was she took on the hunger strikers and beat them. And the third thing, and broke the back of the IRA at that time as well. And the third thing she did, she said, Ulster is more British than Finchley. And that's the legacy that we have in Northern Ireland. A United Kingdom that's more unified than ever before. And Northern Ireland is an integral part of that as never before. That's a legacy that we're worth holding on to as well.
Well, I've always regarded the honourable member as my honourable friend. I do thank him for making that point. I think the only upsetting point that I can recall as far as Northern Ireland concerned was one moment during Prime Minister's question time when there was a very unfortunate exchange between Enoch Powell and Margaret. But that's all history now, and it's very, very good that the honourable member has paid tribute to Margaret's legacy in terms of how Ireland is today. Yeah. But we shouldn't forget anything that Margaret did in terms of education. We know the slogan, the unfortunate slogan, but how many people actually realise that Margaret created more comprehensive schools than any education secretary before or after her. Now, some members might say we don't support it, but I'm just saying to the House, again, she was misrepresented. As Prime Minister, she offered schools a chance to come out of direct council control, a policy which I note is successful and popular to this day. She implemented a core curriculum with a national standard which every school had to attain. She focused this curriculum upon the essentials, maths, English and sciences. I know the present Secretary of State for Education certainly applauds Margaret's policies. Parents were given more power in how schools were administered. Government designed policies around serving children and parents. Her policy victories in this area and more widely are no small feat. But let me turn now to tangible legacies, because at the moment these are words. Her tangible legacies are where I was born, the East End of London. She, through her dynamism, absolutely changed Docklands that everyone enjoys now, particularly during last year's Olympic Games. The Telegraph recently ran a story asking, will Canary Wharf be Baroness Thatcher's greatest lasting legacy? I know it will be one of them. After designating the London Docklands as an enterprise zone and offering tax breaks to local businesses, the then Prime Minister phoned Paul Reichman to kick-start the project and persuaded him, as only she could, to take on the project. None of this could have happened without the lifting of exchange controls, which Baroness Thatcher was when she was first elected. Finance from abroad poured into London, and London became the most prominent city in the world. The regeneration of a huge area took place over the next few decades, and East London is now entirely unrecognisable from my childhood. The Docklands Light Railway was part of this legacy, a line which has assisted greatly in the quite stunning transformation of East London. And then, Mr. Speaker, Margaret Thatcher was always described as being anti-Europe. For 100 years, people had talked about the Channel Tunnel, but did it happen? Absolutely not. But it was Margaret Thatcher who was responsible for driving the grand infrastructure project entirely, and I was then Michael Putillo's private parliamentary secretary, and we walked together down the Channel Tunnel as it was being bought. Absolutely extraordinary, which today we take for granted, entirely due to Margaret Thatcher. And I well remember when she met the then President Mitterrand halfway down the tunnel. The previous project had been started in 1974, but it had to be abandoned because of financial pressure built up during the old broken consensus. It took a more innovative approach, and she asked private companies to tender for contracts in 1981, and just 9 years later the tunnel was built. It was part of her wider vision to build up Britain again and to revitalise our economy. Even the routes of Crossrail today, which we can all see with our own eyes, can be found in Margaret's time, when a former director, UKCG, remembers she really pushed Crossrail forward. This project also gives us an insight into the outward-looking nature of Mrs Thatcher's leadership. It was a leadership which didn't just look to Britain's shores, but also looked to change the world. And my goodness, Mr Speaker, what an international leader Baroness Thatcher was. She showed a remarkable aptitude for the international political stage. Unlike some leaders who are no longer in the House, she was far from being a warmonger. She used to do everything she possibly could to avoid war and broker peace. It was only the example of the Falklands, when it was evaded, that she had to defend those isles. So I struggled to put it better than Niall Ferguson, who wrote, she was also mostly right about foreign policy. She was right to drive the forces of Argentina's junta out of the Falklands, and she was right to exhort a wobbly George W. Bush to mete out the same treatment to Saddam Hussein's forces in Kuwait. Like Ronald Reagan, she was quick to see the opportunity offered by Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika. She was right about Europe, supporting the idea of free and fair trade whilst opposing the idea of a unified currency. Europe was still divided between East and West when she was first elected, and we know it was a Soviet press that nicknamed her the Iron Lady. She was strong when necessary, but she was conciliatory too. And when I had the privilege to meet Mikhail Gorbachev when he came to this place, and he looked at me in those days, he said, David, you're young to be a member of Parliament. I said to him, well, you're very young to be the Soviet leader. But what a different type of leader he was then to some who have followed him since. When Margaret, Ronald and Mikhail were working together, my goodness, they made a huge difference. And it was a result of Margaret's policy that eventually the Berlin Wall was taken down. And I was delighted to see that a council in Poland is trying to rename a roundabout after Margaret, as roundabouts, as far as I'm concerned, ensure U-turns are redundant. Margaret is a hugely popular figure in Poland today. Her visit in 1988 is well remembered, establishing an alternative option for government in the minds of the Polish people. She had the presence to change a nation's mind in one visit. I'm not surprised that President Reagan was in awe of this remarkable woman. Not content with defeating socialism at home, although sadly as a result of that she gave us Tony Blair, together with President Reagan she vanquished the forces of communism across Europe, and there are many millions of people who rightly revere her name for bringing about freedom, democracy and commercial opportunity to Eastern Europe. I suppose, Mr. Speaker, one of the only things I'll ever be remembered for is the 1992 election. Although for me privately, when I won the first time in 1983, that was my greatest moment. I was under the cosh, as my right honourable friend, the member for Rayleigh, will attest to, as he ran the campaign team in his remarkable way. Every single journalist, not only locally, nationally, but internationally, descended on Basildon because they had been told by my enemies that we're getting in Barclays Bank tellers to do the count and it'll be done within an hour and you will see live on TV the first Conservative to lose their seat. So who came to my rescue, Mr. Speaker? Margaret Thatcher. Just 3 days before the general election, she arrived, as always, magnificently dressed in blue, and she was given a heroine's welcome. So, for me, I actually owe her everything, particularly in 1992. I won't dwell, Mr. Speaker, on what happened when she stood down as Prime Minister. I think it's best to draw a line under it. I would just say to my Conservative colleagues in the Chamber, we should never ever air our dirty linen in public. And the greatest leader that I've ever known should certainly have been treated in a different way to that which she was. And considering that I represented a highly marginal seat, I had nothing to gain. I had everything to lose. So, Mr. Speaker, because I do want to allow my honourable friend, whose father, Lord Hurd of Westfield, was of course at the end Margaret's Foreign Secretary, I want to end with these words, and I can find no finer words than my own in Margaret Thatcher's A Tribute in Words and Pictures compiled by Ian Dale. Apparently, I said, Margaret Thatcher was a consummate politician. She had those unique qualities of charisma, enormous courage and determination. She was blessed with first-class skills of leadership and undoubtedly not only changed this country, but the world for the better. She was, Mr. Speaker, a remarkable Prime Minister. She is indeed an inspiration to any young woman today, proving that women cannot just do an equal job to men. In my experience, and certainly in my own household, they can do a far superior job to us men. It is difficult to believe that the same Prime Minister who revitalised East London, the place where I grew up, successfully restructured the whole economy, dragging Britain away from the danger zone, leaving the physical marks of her success, for instance, in Eurostar and the London Docklers. Margaret loved this country and loved the place in which we now work. She believed in the supremacy of Parliament, as I do, and as you certainly do, Mr. Speaker. May the army of unelected decision-makers take note of what I've just said. She stood up for Britain in Europe and liberated the Falkland Islands from the Argentinian invaders. She stood up for freedom and democracy against the tyranny of communism. She defeated socialism. She believed that government should create the conditions under which every human being should be given the opportunity to make the most of their lives. She made this country and our world better places in which to live. She is certainly the greatest politician I have ever met, and I'm just so blessed that I actually worked in this place under her leadership in this Parliament. The memory of this remarkable lady will last forever.
Adding the debate, I call the Minister for Civil Society in the Cabinet Office, Mr. Nick Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I feel a lot better having listened to that speech. The Honourable Member for Southend West, my friend, is a very distinguished member of this House. I think he is wearing his 1983 tie with pride, as he should. I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, that he's had the opportunity to place on record, with the passion and conviction that he is known for, his great and persistent admiration and loyalty to Margaret Thatcher. I'm also delighted that he's been so well supported by colleagues and friends here, not least fellow 83ers, the members for Aldershot and Bexley Heath. It was hard to disagree with a single syllable of what he said, particularly, Mr. Speaker, when he talked about what Margaret Thatcher did to reverse the tide of defeatism in this country and to unleash aspiration. And he spoke very movingly about how she had inspired him. Well, she inspired so many others. I know he struggled to find a quote to encapsulate her greatness that matched the one that he provided to Ian Dale, but if I could humbly suggest some other quotes that emerged at the time from the leader of the free world, for example, the United States President, who said that she stands an example to our daughters that there is no glass ceiling that can't be shattered. As Prime Minister, she helped restore the confidence and pride that has always been the hallmark of Britain at its best. Our own Prime Minister spoke very well, I think, in saying that her legacy would be the fact she served her country so well, she saved our country, and that she showed immense courage in doing so. I think the Leader of Opposition deserves credit for also saying how unique figure she was and how she reshaped the politics of a whole generation. And he was entirely right in talking about her legacy. I think we're all painfully aware as politicians that very few of us who pass through this place leave any traces that stand the test of time. The central point he's making is that the legacy that she leaves is as lasting, as far-reaching as anyone's, and I think the only point of comparison is with Winston Churchill. And I think that is the main point he was making, and I totally agree with him. Like him, I was very proud, Mr. Speaker, to be at St Paul's with other colleagues to represent our constituents. I was there with my father, that he was very kind to mention, who served Margaret Thatcher for such a long time. It did feel like a passing of an era. Much has been said and was said about her strength and resolve. If I may just say so personally, I was so pleased that in all the tributes that came out, that so much was said about her personal kindness and courtesy, as well as alongside the Boadicea tributes. It was hard not to be moved by the concern that she showed for the families of British soldiers, not least those who died in the Falklands. My father still speaks of his admiration about the way she handled herself in the incredibly difficult situation after the Hillsborough tragedy, walking around the hospital with him, talking to families as they stood round the bedsides of young lads from Liverpool, many of whom were to go on to die. He said she was absolutely magnificent in a situation he found personally very awkward. She didn't. She knew exactly what to do. And I was also pleased, Mr. Speaker, that the Bishop of London, in his address, which I thought was admirable, also nailed a few of the myths, not least one I feel very strongly about, which is the myth around the misquotation around there is no such thing as a society. She went on to say, of course, that my meaning was clear at the time, but subsequently distorted beyond recognition, What she meant to say, and did say, was that society was not an abstraction separate from the men and women who composed it, but a living structure of individuals, families, neighbours and voluntary associations. And I'm personally, Mr. Speaker, proud to be part of a government that is trying to reassert that value of social responsibility, that word she felt so strongly, alongside everything else that we're doing, which I see as very conservative things and values, to get this country back to living within its means, to make work pay, to support the wealth creators and the job creators, as I sincerely hope that what he described, and I agree, as one of the greatest leaders that this country has ever seen, would approve.
Order. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.